The first note came in with the tide, slick as a fish and twice as slippery. Marin spotted it as she crossed the promenade at White Point Garden, moonlight frosting the harbor, palmettos whispering like a small conspiracy. The envelope perched against the base of a cannon, its edges wrinkled from salt and travel, a red wax seal stubbornly intact despite the water. It was a ridiculous place for a letter. It was also the kind of thing that made Marin's pulse drum. Some small artifact that didn't belong, asking to be placed back into a story. She told herself to leave it. It could be a prank, a tourist's flourish, a soggy prop for a proposal gone wrong. But the wax bore a tidy insignia, asterisk asterisk, a tiny rice sheaf encircled by a crescent asterisk asterisk, and her hand moved before the rest of her agreed. The paper was warm where the ocean had carried it. A scent, asterisk asterisk, pluff mud and lilac asterisk asterisk, lifted when she broke the seal. Inside, a single line in slanted ink. Asterisk, Miss Hart, you restore houses. Can you restore a promise? Her name. The water made her shiver, but it was the ink that raised the fine hairs along her arms. She looked around, couples drifting beneath oaks, the broad backs of houses along East Bay, the distant hush of waves against the Ravenel Bridge. No one looked back at her. She slipped the note into her coat pocket and walked, the slow pace of someone who doesn't want to appear hunted. In her condo off King Street, the letter dried on the kitchen counter beside a bowl of gully-grown okra she'd meant to cook and never did. The script was old-fashioned but not old. Someone rehearsed the past on purpose. She held it under lamplight until the salt filmed her fingers. Restore a promise. She thought of mortar lines and flaking paint, porches that sagged because someone stopped caring. Houses were promises made of wood. We will keep you safe. She had been repairing such vows since she moved to Charleston 3 years before, after leaving a Boston life as sterile and bright as a dentist's office. Her phone buzzed. Delilah Priolo always called late, when the museum slept and the ghosts paced in their stays. Marin, darling, could you spare an eye for my piazza brackets? They've decided to rebel. You're aware it's nearly midnight. I am aware it's nearly collapse, and I dread paperwork more than I dread the hour. Marin smiled despite herself. Morning, then. And Marin? Bring your good sense. We've had visitors. Delilah's paws pressed at the edges of the call. The leaving kind. The next day tasted like heat already at 8 a.m., Spanish moss hanging in lazy banners as Marin turned onto South Battery. Delilah's narrow museum house wore its wrought iron gate like jewelry. Reeves Sinclair was there on the steps, broad-shouldered, laugh tucked away as if laughter cost money. He was the kind of handsome that made people tell the truth or lie with better posture. Sinclair, Marin said, nodding. You build boats, not brackets. Delilah bribed me with Benny wafers. His eyes dipped toward her coat pocket, where the letter now lived in a hard plastic sleeve. You're hiding something. Work. My condolences. Inside, Delilah led them down a bright hall cooled by heart pine floors. She spoke in a low voice as though the house could eavesdrop. Every morning this week, someone has left an envelope at the gate. Not addressed, not stamped. I assumed fundraising. Then yesterday's asked a question only a fool or a ghost would ask. She held up a sleeve twin to Marin's. In it a second letter. Asterisk, promises rot from the porch inward. The first beam gives today. Marin felt the room tilt by degrees. And did it? Delilah gestured at the piazza door. Marin stepped onto the shaded balcony and saw a cracked bracket, hairline at the joinery, spidering down like a drawn breath. If the bracket failed, the porch would list. Just enough to be noticed, just enough to start a slow catastrophe. Not a guess then. A warning. A voice drifted from street level. Ms. Priolo? Avery Kane, the Deep East podcast. A woman with dark curls and a confidence that belonged to people who edited their own pauses waved up from the sidewalk. I heard about your letters. Delilah's glance could have ironed linen. Of course you did. Avery smiled like a locksmith. Don't mind me. I'll keep out of the way. No, you won't, Marin said. But you'll try. Avery's eyes skipped to Reeves and back to Marin's pocket. And you're holding the new one. They took coffee in the back garden among camellias that were trying to bloom out of season because Charleston bends time to mood. Avery set a small recorder between the cups. Isn't it something? Romantic in a noir way. A correspondent who knows your day before you do. Romantic isn't the word I'd choose, Marin said. It's exactly the word, Avery countered. Letters. Promises. A house. All romance is a renovation project. Marin told them about the midnight letter at the cannon, her name in that tidy hand. Reeves listened like a boat listens to wind, every small shift taken seriously. Who knows your route? He asked. Clients. Friends. The city if it's bored. Avery lifted the recorder, eyes bright. May I? No, Delilah and Marin said together. The bracket repair took the morning. Reeves worked the wood with quiet competence, and Marin braced from below, hands sticky with glue and Charleston heat. While they worked, she thought about the seal, the rice sheaf, the crescent, and what it meant. Old families used marks like that. Old families wrote promises that made new people pay. She barely noticed when Avery slipped away. At noon, the marsh shrimp boats started parading home along Shem Creek, and Reeves suggested lunch at a place where the paper menus were stained with garlic butter and every second person knew his name. Captain Boone materialized beside their table like a storm cloud with teeth. You're the architect, he said to Marin. And you're the one who asks questions for free, he said to Avery. To Reeves, watch your fingers, boy. Boone's stories came at you like waves, steady, insistent. When Marin mentioned the seal, he chewed and frowned. Rice sheaf with a moon? That's Priolo adjacent, if you care for a tangle. Might also be Pinckney-ish if you squint. Delilah Priolo runs the house, Marin said. Boone blinked. Then your letter knows its way home. They left early to catch the afternoon light on Rainbow Row, where Marin liked to walk the colors like a paint deck and imagine which house would sigh first in a hurricane. Reeves matched her pace, long strides careful on cobblestones. You didn't answer, he said eventually. Can you restore a promise? Depends who broke it. And if it's you? She laughed once. Then it's already a salvage job. A man stood across the street photographing the pink facade, and nothing about him should have been remarkable, tourist hat, sensible shoes, except the way he framed his shot with the camera down at his hip, angled toward Marin instead of the house. When she glanced up, he smiled, a polite apology, then turned and vanished into the alley of ironwork and shadows that cut toward the harbor. Reeves saw it too. You've collected a tale, he said too easily. By evening, the air turned sweet with jasmine and the city pretended summer wasn't still hunched on its shoulders. Marin let herself back into her place, kicked off her shoes, opened a beer she'd never finish, and spread 2 letters across the counter like clues at a small, private trial. Miss Hart, both began in that handsomely careful hand. She pulled out tracing paper and sketched the seal from memory. The crescent tipped slightly, ***, not like the state flag ***, and the rice sheaf had exactly 9 grains. Odd, fussy details. She made a list of old houses that once stored rice, of families that traded in moonlit symbols, of clients who liked to pretend they were carved from history instead of money. A soft rap sounded at her door. 3 knocks, evenly spaced. She glanced through the peephole. No one. When she opened it, the hallway smelled faintly of river and rain, as if someone had carried the water up 12 flights. At her feet lay a 3rd envelope, beaded with condensation from a very recent swim. Inside, the letter was longer. The ink trembled, or maybe her fingers did. *, promises rot from the porch inward. Yours began 8 years ago in Boston, with a phone call you didn't take. A woman asked you to save a house. You refused. She drowned before the winter thaw. This city has tides like memory, Miss Hart. Tonight at high tide, a key will surface at the battery. If you want to keep someone else from drowning, be there when the water gives it back. Her mouth went dry in a way no beer could fix. 8 years ago, Boston, a phone call she didn't take. The ache of recognition pierced so cleanly she almost admired it. There had been a woman, and a storm, and a voicemail she'd deleted because saving a house had sounded like saving a person and she hadn't been that brave yet. She called Reeves. He answered on the first ring, breathless, as if he'd run only to the phone. "I've got another letter," she said. "There's a key coming in with high tide." "What time?" 11:24. "Meet me at the cannon," he said. "The one that chose you." The harbor at night was a dark ribbon stitched by the Ravenel Bridge and pricked with red and green lights that moved like thoughts. Couples drifted. Wind pressed the palmettos to prayer. Marin and Reeves walked the lip of the seawall, scanning the slosh of black water against pale stone. The tide surged, then sucked back, the city breathing. "There," Reeves said, "point." Something glinted in the foam and lodged briefly where an old brick met new. Marin reached, fingers numbing, and closed on a small brass key so cold it felt alive. On its shank, engraved, W.T., the letters seal in miniature. She held it up, heart pounding. "What does it open?" Reeves asked. "The past," Marin said, trying to make light of it and failing. A shadow separated from the oaks. A man in that sensible tourist hat from Rainbow Row stood watching, hands in his pockets, posture relaxed in a way that required effort. He smiled like a neighbor and spoke like a note slid under a door. "Careful, Miss Hart. Some promises sink for a reason." He tipped the brim and turned into the darkness, swallowed by the garden as if it had been rehearsing to take him back all day. Marin stared at the key, the letters, the water, and felt the city tilt an inch toward her, like someone choosing a dance partner. The next wave hissed over the seawall and soaked her shoes, cold as a warning. "We're in it now," Reeves said quietly. "We've been in it," she answered. "We just finally heard the music. The key is real, the watcher is real, and the house waiting for that key might be closer to Marin than any address she's willing to admit." Morning came in layers, gull cries, a hush of tires on wet cobblestone, the slow bell at St. Philip's stitching the hour into the air. Marin had barely slept. The key, small, brass, stamped WD, lay on her nightstand like a heartbeat she could hear. She watched the light move across it and tried to pretend it didn't change shape as it brightened, that it wasn't one thing at midnight and another at 9 a.m. When she finally rose, she put the key in her pocket the way some people wore faith. Not because it proved anything, but because it argued with fear. Reeves texted an address and 2 words, "Bring coffee." She brewed strong and dark, poured it into a thermos scuffed from too many job sites, and walked out into a Charleston morning that smelled like the ocean remembered something. On Meeting Street, the carriages were already clopping past, the drivers narrating a tidy version of history for people who wanted the past to stand still. Marin crossed through drifting tour groups and cut over toward Church Street, where the shade held on longer and the oaks leaned like listeners. Reeves waited at the corner of a narrow lane flanked by high brick walls scarred with tobacco-stained vines. He wore a denim shirt rolled to the elbows and a look that said he'd been up thinking too. "You beat me by 2 minutes, he said, taking the thermos like it was evidence. "Captain Boone chewed on that seal all night." "And?" Marin asked. Boone's opinion, free as always, W.P., could mean White Point, meaning the battery. Or West Pier, the old name for the ferry landing. Or, he paused, eyes lifting to the narrow stretch ahead, Whitaker Priolo ***. A hyphenated house. Old rice money met older sugar money, ended up with one of those stubborn double names. Marin felt the key's weight against her hip like an answer. "You're guessing." "I'm patterning," he said, and grinned quick as a rumor. "Come on." The lane opened into a small square of silence the city had forgotten. A walled garden with jasmines climbing a trellis, the ground paved in tabbies studded with oyster shell. At the far end stood a modest carriage house with washed lime walls and shuttered windows, a door with an old iron escutcheon that had known better days. To the left, an arched gate led, Marin would have bet her license, into the yard of a larger house. Reeves pointed to the lintel above the gate, where someone long ago had set 2 initials into the mortar, W and P, simple as truth. The key warmed in Marin's pocket like it wanted out. "Delilah would have mentioned if this was hers," Marin said, voice low because the space asked for it. "So whose is it?" "According to the city's dusty index," Reeves said, producing a folded printout from his back pocket, "the main house belongs to an LLC with a Savannah address. Vacant for renovations." The carriage house, This was severed into its own parcel decades ago. Nobody's been inside for a while. His eyes flicked to the iron gate. Want to see if your brass prayer fits? Marin touched the gate as if waking a sleeping dog. The ironwork was delicate, a pattern of rice sheaves woven into a crescent, her seal writ larger, or maybe the seal was a memory of this. She set the key to the lock and paused, hand trembling more than she wanted to admit. If a stranger left this for me on the battery, she said, I am aware of how dangerous it is to make their wish come true. Reeves didn't argue. He stood close enough she could count the sawdust grains that lived perpetually along his sleeves. We do one thing at a time, he said. We open the door. If the air inside smells wrong, we close it. If it smells right, we still consider closing it. She turned the key. It resisted, then moved with a small arthritic sigh like it remembered being used by gentler hands. The latch lifted. The gate opened inward 2 inches, then 3, then enough for a person to slip through sideways if they promised to be kind. Memory moved with the hinges, a breath of old wood, soap and silt, and Marin stepped into a yard where the grass had given up on impressing anyone. The main house beyond the carriage house revealed itself only in parts. The line of a piazza, the sliver of a fanlight, a corner of stucco that had sloughed under too many summers. It wasn't large by Charleston standards, but it was proud. A house that had once believed in parties with iced bowls of punch and songs sung to prove bloodlines. The carriage house door's lock matched the gates, as if one craftsman had loved symmetry enough to make it an oath. The key turned again. The door opened. Stale light, dust like salt in sunbeams, the quiet of a room that had done too much waiting. Marin stood in a square of cool and drank it in the way she often drank the first seconds of a house. The list of what it was willing to confess. Workbench against the wall, a set of shaving horses like sleeping steeds, coils of hemp rope hardened with time. A half-built skiff rested upside down on trestles, its ribs exposed like a chest that needed listening. On the far wall, a framed map of the harbor hung crooked, its paper browned. Reeves walked to the skiff and laid his palm on its belly like a doctor checking a pulse. Cypress, he murmured. Old planks, new fasteners. Someone restarted a project that used to belong to someone else. Marin's breath steadied, her mind running its usual grids, the weight of the roofline, the stagger of the floorboards, the narrative of water. This space stays dry even when the yard doesn't, she said, pointing to the tide marks faint on the baseboards. Whoever worked here knew where the flood came and learned to step aside. Like a promise that leaks from the bottom, Reeves said, half to himself. On the workbench lay a ledger, its leather swollen and salt-stained, a red ribbon peeking from its center like a tongue. Marin tugged it free and laid it flat. Names and numbers marched across the pages, asterisk asterisk quantities of rice, casks promised, wages owed asterisk asterisk, the mathematics of an old life. And then, halfway through, the ledger changed voices. The hand that had made lists gave way to a slanted, careful script she recognized from the letters, like an actor stepping onto a stage another had built. If you restore a promise, start with the beam that thinks it's alone. The new script read on a page dated, Marin's stomach tightened, asterisk asterisk 8 years ago asterisk asterisk this very week. Asterisk, call the work by its right name. Begin where the water pauses before it enters. A noise came from the yard. The scrape of a shoe. Reeves froze, eyes on the door. Marin closed the ledger gently, as though the sound could hear paper. Footsteps passed the carriage house and went on to the main house's piazza, an even rhythm, unhurried. Reeves moved to the window and lifted one slat of the shutter with a carpenter's stealth. He looked for a long breath, then let the shutter fall and stepped back. 2 men, he said. Short sleeves. Carrying nothing that looks like a clipboard and everything that looks like they don't need one. Marin swallowed dry air. The watcher. Different posture, Reeves said. But same permission. People who expect the space to split for them. He nodded toward the back door that led deeper into the lot. We can walk out now, wave, play dumb. Or we can learn why someone left you a key by not doing what they think we'll do. Marin's mouth twitched. I have practice at not doing what people think. They slipped through the rear of the carriage house into a narrow service passage choked with angel vine, emerging onto a strip of broken tabby that ran behind the main house like a spine. On the ground, half buried in the crusted shell, something bright caught the light. Marin crouched. Another seal, this one broken lay in the grit, the crescent smashed through the rice sheaf. A message or a temper? Reeves touched her shoulder lightly. It was the kind of touch that said we're here rather than I want you, and because it was the first kind, it made the second hum anyway. You hear that? He asked. Marin listened. Beyond traffic and cicadas and the distant mutter of a tour guide was a sound like breathing through a wall ***, a hush and push, as if the house itself were working at speech. It was water in pipes, or it was the tide under the floor, or it was fear inventing sounds to match itself. The men's footsteps crossed above them on the piazza, boards laying out their weight, and then the front door opened and closed, and quiet returned like a decision. We should go, Marin said, before quiet changes its mind. They retraced to the carriage house. Before she stepped out, Marin tucked the ledger under her arm without fully permitting herself to call it theft. Outside, she locked the door and gate, turning the key twice like an incantation. The initials over the arch winked in the noon light as if they knew she was pretending the rules were hers to write. It was only on Trad Street, halfway to the noise where she could breathe again, that they saw Avery Kane. She stood with her back against a peeling stucco wall, recorder in hand but not raised, gaze sharpened by the kind of waiting that eats people from the edges inward. I didn't follow you, she said, which of course meant she had. But the city narrows when secrets walk. How was the house? Marin kept her face unhelpful. If there had been a house, she said, it would need paint. Avery's eyes slid to the edge of the ledger peeking from Marin's tote and back up with a small smile. Paint is the last thing. Paint is what people do to feel like they did something. She leaned in, dropping her voice. So here's my trade. You keep your ledger. I trade you a name for W.P., not a guess. A name that lives in 2 Polaroids and 1 probate filing. You're an architect, you like documents that thought they were sleeping. Reeves folded his arms, lazy as a guard dog who was actually vicious. What's your price? First interview writes if someone turns up dead, Avery said, fast and light and nearly a joke. Then, softer, and a seat at the table when you open whatever that key opens next. I don't like watching through glass. Marin felt the ledger's weight. She thought of last night's letter, of the drowned woman she had failed by delay, of the men with unbothered footsteps. She nodded once. Name. Avery's smile was a quick blade. Whitaker Priolo House, she said. The hyphen hurts to say but money likes hyphens. Whitaker died, no heirs. The Priolo niece married a banker who got bored with the cost of roofs. ILC was a way to pretend the house would save itself. The carriage house, where you didn't go, obviously, belonged to a Bowtrite named Hale who took some things with him when he left town. A ledger is one of the things he would have left only if someone asked him hard. Marin and Reeves didn't bother pretending anymore. Reeves's eyes narrowed. Hale. Avery nodded. Hale worked boats and promises. The kind of man who keeps his tools in alphabetical order and his lies in a drawer with a lock. She raised the recorder, then lowered it again with visible effort. Also, there's a photograph of him at White Point Garden, holding a key on a ribbon. Polaroid dated 8 years ago, week of the storm that drowned your Boston woman. The ribbon's seal? Crescent and sheaves. Marin's legs felt unreliable. Where did you get that image? From a woman who thought it was romantic, Avery said. And from a cousin who knows where the family keeps its boxes. Look, I didn't come to swindle you. I chase stories because I don't like watching people bleed quietly. If the house is calling, let me listen too. The growl of a truck rounded the corner, too big for the lane, inching past with a patience that felt performative. The passenger glanced their way, jotted something, not hiding it. Reeves stepped closer without thinking and made a wall of himself and Marin's tote. The truck's brake hissed like a released breath. It moved on. Okay, Marin said into the space the truck left behind. Tonight we go back. No lights. We see if the key opens the main house too. Avery's grin made her look younger and meaner. I do love a trespass with a point. Not trespass, Reeves said calmly. Inspection. With context. Marin walked alone at dusk, because some decisions ask for solitude. The city shifted into its evening costume. Gas lamps softened, the river pulled its dark blanket higher, voices warmed and fell. She fed a quarter into a newspaper box that hadn't met a headline in months just to hear it clunk. She thought about the Boston winter the letter had named, about her mother's voice on the phone telling her, "You can't save the world by saving houses," about the way Marin had hung up gentler than she felt. At White Point Garden, kids ran in pockets of light while their parents pretended to listen to one another. The canon that had first offered her an envelope sat like a dare she'd already accepted. She half expected another letter to slide from under it like a card in a magician's hand. None did. Instead, a tourist hat tipped in her periphery, and the man from yesterday stepped out of the sort of shadows that welcomed him like a member. "Evening, Miss Hart," he said, his voice the temperature of porcelain. "We keep sharing views." "I don't share," she said. "I occupy." He smiled like a substitute teacher. Occupation implies tenure. Charleston eats tenants. The trick is to know which houses want you to keep them and which want to be let go. He glanced toward the water where low tide peeled the harbor down to its thoughts. Or which promises are kinder broken. "Who are you?" Marin asked. "An admirer of architecture," he said. "And of people who don't scare easy." His eyes ticked to the pocket where the key lived. "Be careful what doors you wake up. Some of them dream back." When he left, she didn't follow. The tide ran out like a gown being pulled, and the wind shifted, bringing with it the sweet rot of the marsh. She texted Reeves a single word, "Ready." He answered with a dropped pin and a sentence that made her smile despite everything, "Bring gloves. The house will be offended by fingerprints." They met at the lane again near midnight, Avery shadowing in as if the dark had cut a slice in itself and saved the triangle for her. Reeves carried a pack with what Marin recognized as ethical breaking and entering. Wedges, a long-handled mirror, soft shoes, flashlights wrapped in red gel. He passed Marin a pair of cotton gloves and nodded toward the key like he approved of her choice in jewelry. The gate admitted them with less protest this time, as if the first hello had done the work. The yard was a map of night sounds, leaf whisper, a distant freighter's horn, the creak of a branch riding on the sky. The main house loomed in a silhouette that made its piazza columns look taller and thinner, like people losing weight in a bad season. The front door's lock was newer than its face, polished brass that tried too hard. Reeves shook his head at it, then pointed to a side service door asterisk tucked under the piazza stairs, its keyhole old enough to remember brass as a novelty. Marin knelt and set the W key to the hole. It hesitated, then agreed. The door opened into breath, cool, revered, not unfriendly. Their red-wrapped beams swept a butler's pantry, shelves lined with jars evacuated of meaning, a dumbwaiter yawning like a small dark mouth, then a narrow hall that funneled toward the heart of the house. The floor gave a polite little sigh with each step, the boards announcing them to ghosts and anyone worse than ghosts. They paused at a doorway where a parlor opened wide. The room's bones were good, but the skin had been peeled for renovation and left shivering, mantel naked without its mirror, plaster patched and unsanded, picture rails slumped. On the far wall, someone had hung a canvas drop cloth to keep dust off something square. Reeves held the light while Marin lifted the cloth's edge. A portrait stared back with the kind of intensity old paintings have when they're tired of being misread. A woman, early 30s, dark hair pinned back too tightly for her face, eyes a color the painter had made from patience. Around her throat, a ribbon held a small brass key, the shape familiar enough to make Marin's pulse thicken. At her shoulder, the painter had sketched a hint of the Whitaker Priolo piazza, columns softened by habit. The brass plate at the frame's lower edge read Eliza Priolo Whitaker, 1883. Avery breathed out a word that wasn't a word at all. Reeves whispered, "Hale didn't start the story." He found a page and copied the handwriting. Marin stared until her eyes watered, then lowered the cloth like a curtain at the end of a performance that had only faked ending. They moved on, the house introducing rooms like old friends. In a back study, A desk with a roll top slumbered under dust, its lock broken in a tidy way, the work of someone with keys and patience. Marin slid the top open, trying not to think of other things that slid and opened and offered teeth. Inside lay papers laid out with ritual neatness, receipts for lumber, estimates for plaster, and, at the bottom, an envelope with a wax seal unbroken, crescent hole, sheaves unbent. It was addressed to Hale in that handsome slanted hand. Marin looked at Reeves. He looked back. Avery mouthed "Do it," like no one could hear when she didn't even breathe. Marin broke the seal. Inside was a single page. The script leaned as if it were eager. Asterisk, you refused Boston because you knew the water and the cold and the weight of a stranger's voice could tip you into a life you weren't ready to hold. You are not refusing Charleston. Not because you are braver now, but because you are lonelier. The key on Eliza's throat never opened a lock. It opened a story. Hale copied it and tried to end it at a ledger when a ledger was a beginning. The promise rots inward. The beam that thinks it is alone lives beneath the back stair. There is a box there, and in it, a photograph. Find it before the men who don't knock find you. A floorboard murmured overhead. Reeves's hand found Marin's forearm, not gentle, not rough, just true. Avery's eyes went to the ceiling with the quick caution of someone who's lived in apartments with thin floors and temperamental neighbors. The footsteps above were not normal. They were measured. They were the sound of boots trying to be polite and failing. This way, Marin whispered, and they slipped into the narrow corridor that led to the back stair. The steps were steep, their treads dished by a century of servants' shoes. Marin crouched at the second riser, pressed her fingertips under the nosing, felt nothing. Third riser, nothing. Fourth, her glove met smooth wood with a seam. Reeves knelt beside her and took a slim blade from his pocket, easing it along the seam until a small panel lifted like a secret that wanted to be told. Inside, a cigar box small enough to insult the hand that reached for it nested among nail heads, its lid tied shut with a gray ribbon. Marin slid the box out and retied the panel with her breath where her hands should have been. The footsteps overhead changed direction, angling toward the stair that would pour people into the narrow with them if they let it. Decision time, Avery whispered, voice as thin as a thread but stronger. Do we run brave or we run fast? Marin tucked the cigar box into her tote and made a choice because choices are what hold houses up and keep promises from souring. Fast, she said. Brave is what we call it later, if we're lucky. They retraced their path to the side door, light beams cut to slivers, breaths filed down to be less noticeable. The door knew enough to be silent this time. The yard received them like a cold cloth. The gate remembered what to do. They were in the street and walking like people who had never learned to run in small spaces when a voice just behind them said, pleasant as a hi-hat, evening again. The man in the tourist hat stood where the lane met the wider road, the brim shadowing a face that always felt borrowed from someone friendlier. He raised his hands like a conductor asking for quiet and got it, because sometimes the air obeys the person who loves it least. Behind him, a dark sedan idled with its lights off. The two men from earlier leaned against it like punctuation marks that preferred periods. You're quick, the hat said, eyes on Marin's tote as if they could read through canvas. But not quick enough that you won't consider advice. Put back what you took. Tell yourself the house kept it. Walk home with your heart unbroken and your boots dry. Reeves stepped half a pace to the side, enough to be between the hat and Marin without making a declaration he'd have to back with bone. Sometimes we keep things until we understand why they were offered, he said. You sound like a man who hates questions. We're not that kind. The hat's smile was bright and short-lived. Questions are fine, he said. It's answers that rust. Be careful what you clean. He tipped the brim again and turned away the way he always did, like he trusted the world to make space for his back. The sedan eased behind him, swallowed the men, slid off. They didn't wait to be followed. They didn't stop until Broad Street offered noise and another kind of safety. Police lights drifting at a corner, waiters dragging metal chairs inside, the sheen of normal life that sometimes managed to pass for armor. Only then did they duck into the alley behind a bakery where the yeast-sweet air made everything feel indecently human again. Marin set the cigar box on a stack of flour sacks and tugged the ribbon loose. Inside lay a photograph, curled by time, the edges browned. It showed the Whitaker Priolo Piazza Summerbright, a woman who might have been Eliza's granddaughter laughing toward the camera, and at the edge of the frame, Hale half-turned, as though leaving and deciding against it. Around the woman's neck, a ribbon. At its end, a key that looked like the one in Marin's pocket except for one bright difference. A notch filed into its shoulder, a wound the shape of a crescent. A second picture lay beneath. Boston winter. A snowbank bruised with exhaust. A woman at a stoop with a phone in her hand and impatience at her mouth. The ink on the back read only a date, asterisk asterisk 8 years ago asterisk asterisk, and a street name Marin did not want to see. Her name, asterisk asterisk Marin Hart asterisk asterisk, had been written in an upper corner and then partially erased, the ghost of it still visible when she turned the photograph to the light. Her chest went cold in a way that had nothing to do with the hour. Someone had taken a picture of her while she wasn't looking, had pressed it between layers of this city the way a flower is made to last without living. Avery reached for the photo, then stopped when Marin didn't hand it. "Okay," Reeves said quietly, answering a question none of them had said. "So the promise began earlier than we admitted. And whoever writes letters learned your handwriting from your absence." Marin slipped both photographs back into the box and tied the ribbon again because hands need something to do when the past refuses to behave. "Tomorrow," she said, voice steady by the force you use to make a beam hold. "We find the beam under the back stair. We follow the flood line. We make a list. We do the work. And we keep anything that remembers us without permission." Avery nodded, the recorder still in her pocket like a pet she'd remembered to feed. "And we figure out what the notch in the key means. A duplicate? A warning? A way to tell the real from the rehearsal." Reeves tapped the pocket where Marin's key lived. "Keys can be filed to fit," he said. "But sometimes they're filed to betray." They parted, because nights take people back to their rooms the way tides take their shells. Marin walked up King Street, the moon on its tilt, the Ravenel Bridge strung in white like a necklace a city put on and forgot to take off. In her building's elevator, she watched her reflection and didn't recognize the set of her shoulders. In her kitchen, she laid the cigar box beside the ledger and the letters and the key and made a small museum of bad ideas. The house waited in her head the way a storm waits offshore, spinning, making its mind up. She didn't sleep. When she did fall under for an hour just before dawn, she dreamed she stood under the back stair while water rose, soft as silk but impossible, and someone above whispered her name not to scare her but to make sure she didn't miss the start. Hook asterisk under the back stair, a beam hides more than a box. The notch in the old key hints at a lock altered after a betrayal, and the men who don't knock now know exactly what Marin has taken. Charleston's heat pressed low that morning, as if the air itself wanted to keep secrets close. Marin woke with the photograph from Boston still burning behind her eyes. The box, the diary, the locket, they lay across her table like evidence in a trial she hadn't agreed to. By the time Reeves and Avery texted, she already knew the answer. They were going back. The Whitaker Priolo house loomed over them when they returned. Its piazza columns leaned, but the house still carried pride like perfume. Reeves forced the old service door, and they slipped inside. The house smelled the way basements remember storms, wood damp, plaster tired, dust clinging to breath. They followed the narrow hall to the back stair. The risers were scarred with centuries of shoes. Reeves crouched, set his flat bar to the wood and worked. The fourth step groaned, then gave. Behind it lay a cavity, shallow but deliberate. Marin knelt and pulled free a bundle wrapped in waxed cloth, slick with age. She unwrapped layer after layer until her gloves touched paper. Inside was a diary, pages curled, the ink browned but still legible. A tarnished locket slid free from between the leaves. She flipped it open. The miniature inside was a painted likeness of Eliza Whitaker, her dark eyes sharp, her lips carrying an almost smile that felt more like warning. The diary read like a house learning how to speak. Early entries chronicled garden parties, repairs, accounts of rice trade, then slowly shifted. Hale's name began to appear. At first she described him as steady, reliable. But the tone turned. She wrote of a key, of promises he insisted were his to keep. She wrote of suspicion, of a notch filed into brass. Her last entry ended with ink trailing into water stain. If he alters it, I will never know which door belongs to me. Marin's chest tightened. She could hear her own breathing echo between plaster and silence. Reeves gently shut the diary. Avery's eyes were wide, but her voice was steady. So one key was for her, and the other was for him. The floor above them creaked. Heavy steps moved deliberately across the piazza. Reeves signaled. They packed the diary into Marin's tote, slipped the locket into her pocket, and edged for the rear. They moved through the narrow yard, the jasmine vines brushing their shoulders like fingers. As they reached the alley, Marin glanced back. In the upstairs window stood the man in the tourist hat, perfectly framed in shadow. He didn't move, didn't wave, didn't shout. He only smiled faintly, as if her discovery had been scripted for him. That evening, they sought the water. Captain Boone agreed to take them out on his skiff, the air thick with salt, the creek alive with gulls. Marin held the key and the locket out to him. Boone turned the brass in his broad hands, frowning. "Notch like this isn't for the fit," he said finally. "It's for the story. Means there's a twin. 2 keys. One true, one false. And you can't tell which until the house decides." Reeves leaned on the gunwale, watching shrimp boats haul in nets that glittered silver under the low sun. "So we're trapped between promises." "Or trapped by them," Boone said, spitting overboard. "That family made vows in ink and lumber. Folks like Hale just tried to bend 'em to their own tide." The air shifted. From the marsh grass, something bobbed. Reeves snagged it with a boat hook. A bottle, sealed with the same wax crest. Inside, a photograph curled tight. Marin drew it out with shaking hands. The image was her condo tower, sharp and modern against Charleston's skyline. Across it, scrawled in that familiar ink, asterisk, promises wrought inward. "Yours ends at home." Her stomach dropped. She thought of the envelopes on her kitchen counter. She thought of the feeling she'd had last night, the sense someone had been in her hallway. Reeves saw her face and gripped her wrist. "You're not walking back in there alone." When they returned to the condo, the lock showed no mark. But on the counter, the stack of letters she'd left sealed now lay split open, every wax crest cracked. The paper neatly returned as if a librarian had catalogued her private history. Not theft. Not mess. Just intrusion, polite and total. Avery whispered, "He's not watching from outside anymore." Marin stared at the open envelopes, the key heavy in her pocket. The watcher didn't want her safety. He wanted her attention. They didn't wait for morning. By midnight, they were back at the Whitaker Priolo house, both keys in Marin's hand. The piazza loomed pale, its columns skeletal in the moonlight. Reeves whispered, "Tonight we finish it." The plain key resisted the front lock. The notched one slid smooth, as if it had been waiting. The door opened into a hush that pressed against their ears. The parlor lay ahead, the portrait of Eliza illuminated by stray moonlight. Her painted eyes seemed alive, the painted key at her throat gleaming. Reeves said quietly, "She wore the notched one. She believed it." But upstairs, boots struck. Slow. Intentional. The man in the hat descended the staircase, his silhouette sharp in the glow. "You've chosen his promise," he said calmly. "And promises end the way they were meant to." The floor beneath them trembled. A crack split through plaster, dust raining like ash. The house groaned, centuries of weight collapsing inward. Reeves dragged Marin toward the piazza, Avery sprinting behind. Beams split like bones. Glass shattered in a chorus. They burst into the night as the Whitaker Priolo house folded onto itself, coughing dust into the street like a last breath. They stood in the haze, hearts pounding. Across the road, the man in the hat lingered, untouched. He tipped his brim. "Some houses were built to fall," he said softly, then turned and vanished into the gathering crowd, as if the city itself swallowed him. Later, in Reeves's truck, Marin uncurled her palm. Both keys lay there, unbent, cool against her skin. Neither had been claimed by the collapse. "The house made me choose," she said, voice rough. But it kept both answers. Reeves kept his eyes on the Ravenel Bridge ahead, lights stitched across the water. "So what do we keep now?" Marin looked at him, at Avery asleep against the window, at the city sprawling in shadows. She thought of promises that rot inward, and ones still worth saving. "We keep the kind that don't drown the living," she said at last. The tide surged below, carrying fragments of plaster out to sea. But water always returns. And in Charleston, promises return with it.